Marcus Rivera sat in his small apartment staring at his laptop screen. The numbers on his bank account made his stomach hurt. $150. That was all the money he had left in the world. He had lost his job as a graphic designer 6 months ago. Since then, he had applied for over 200 jobs. No one wanted to hire him. His student loan payments were 3 months behind. His rent was due in 5 days. He had no idea what to do next. Marcus was 34 years old and felt like a complete failure. His friends had good jobs and nice houses. His younger sister was a successful lawyer. His parents kept asking when he would get his life together. He was tired of making excuses. That Tuesday morning, Marcus was looking at foreclosure websites again. He did this every day now. Not because he could buy anything, but because it made him feel better to see that other people had problems too. Maybe someone else was having a worse day than him. He clicked through pages of houses and buildings that banks were selling cheap. Most of them needed thousands of dollars of work. Some were in terrible neighborhoods. Others were too far away from any city to be useful. Then he saw something strange. A commercial building in a small town called Millbrook, Ohio. The starting bid was $99. Marcus read the listing 3 times to make sure he was seeing it right. The building used to be a hardware store. It had been empty for 3 years. The owner had died and left no family. The bank just wanted to get rid of it. The listing said the building was sold as is, with no guarantees about its condition. Marcus looked at the photos. The building looked old but solid. It was made of red brick and had a large front window. The listing said it was 2,400 square feet. In his city, that much space would cost millions of dollars. He read the auction rules. Bidders had to register online and pay a small fee. The auction would end at midnight that same day. The winner had to pay the full amount within 48 hours. Marcus laughed at himself. What was he thinking? He could not buy a building. He did not know anything about real estate. He had never even been to Ohio. This was crazy. But the more he thought about it, the more curious he became. $99 was not much money. Even if the building was completely worthless, he would only lose $99. He had wasted more money than that on stupid things before. Marcus spent the next hour reading about Millbrook, Ohio. It was a small town with about 3,000 people. It used to be bigger when there were more factories, but many businesses had closed over the years. The downtown area was mostly empty now. He looked at street view images of the building on his computer. From the outside, it did not look too bad. The paint was peeling and some windows were boarded up, but the structure seemed sound. There was even a small parking area behind the building. Marcus checked his email and saw another rejection letter from a job he had applied for. The company said they had chosen someone with more experience. He was tired of being rejected, tired of feeling helpless. Maybe it was time to take a chance on something, even if it was stupid. He registered for the auction and paid the $25 fee. That left him with $125. His hands were shaking as he entered his credit card information. This was probably the dumbest thing he had ever done. The auction website showed that nobody else had bid on the building yet. Marcus wondered if that was a good sign or a very bad sign. Maybe other people knew something he did not know. He spent the rest of the day researching everything he could about the building and the town. The hardware store had been called Hoffman's Hardware. It was owned by a man named Bill Hoffman who had run it for over 40 years. Bill had died suddenly of a heart attack 3 years ago. He had no wife or children, so the building went to the bank. Marcus found old newspaper articles about the store. People in the town had loved shopping there. Bill Hoffman was known for being helpful and honest. He could fix almost anything and always had the right part or tool that people needed. When he died, the whole town was sad. The building had been built in 1923. Over the years, it had been many different types of businesses: a grocery store, a five-and-dime shop, a clothing store, and finally Hoffman's Hardware. The listing said it had good bones but needed updating. As the day went on, Marcus became more and more excited about the building. He started imagining what he could do with it. Maybe he could start his own business. Maybe he could rent out space to other people. Maybe he could fix it up and sell it for more money. He knew he was probably being foolish, but for the first time in months, he felt hopeful about something. Even if this turned out badly, at least he was doing something instead of just sitting around feeling sorry for himself. At 11:30 that night, Marcus was still the only bidder. His heart was beating fast. In 30 minutes, he might own a building. It seemed impossible. He refreshed the auction page every few seconds. With 10 minutes left, someone else placed a bid for $100. Marcus immediately bid $110. His hands were sweating. 2 minutes before midnight, the other bidder went to $120. Marcus bid $130. That would leave him with only $20 in his bank account, but he had come this far. The auction ended at exactly midnight. Marcus had won with his bid of $130. He stared at the screen in shock. He owned a building. He actually owned a building in Ohio. Marcus could not sleep that night. Part of him was excited. Part of him was terrified. What had he just done? He had bought a building he had never seen in a town he had never visited. He had no plan and almost no money left. But as he lay in bed, Marcus realized something important. For the first time in months, he was not thinking about his failures. He was thinking about possibilities. Maybe this crazy decision would turn out to be the best thing he had ever done. Or maybe it would be a disaster. Either way, his life was about to change. 3 days after winning the auction, Marcus packed his old Honda Civic with everything he thought he might need. A toolbox his father had given him years ago. A sleeping bag in case he had to spend the night. Some snacks and bottled water. His laptop and a camera to take pictures of his new property. The drive from Chicago to Millbrook, Ohio took 4 hours. Marcus had plenty of time to think about what he was doing. Every few miles he wondered if he should turn around and go home. But he kept driving. The closer he got to Millbrook, the smaller the towns became. He passed through places with only a few hundred people. Many of the main streets had empty storefronts with "for rent" signs that looked like they had been there for years. Marcus had grown up in the city. He was used to busy streets and tall buildings. This rural area felt like a different world. Everything was quiet and spread out. The houses were old, but most of them looked well maintained. People had big yards and gardens. When he finally reached Millbrook, Marcus was surprised by how small it was. The whole downtown area was only about 4 blocks long. Half of the buildings were empty. The ones that were open included a small grocery store, a diner, a bank, and a few other businesses. Marcus drove slowly down Main Street looking for number 412. When he found it, he pulled over and just sat in his car for a few minutes. This was it. This was his building. From the outside, it looked bigger than he had expected. The red brick walls were solid and straight. The big front window was boarded up with plywood, but the frame looked good. Above the window was a faded sign that said, Hoffman's Hardware in blue letters. The building was 2 stories tall. Marcus could see windows on the second floor, though some of them were also boarded up. There was a small alley on one side that led to a parking area behind the building. Marcus got out of his car and walked up to the front door. It was painted green, but the paint was chipped and peeling. He had the keys that the bank's lawyer had mailed to him. His hands were shaking a little as he put the key in the lock. The door opened with a loud creak. Marcus stepped inside and immediately smelled something musty and old. It was not a bad smell, just the smell of a place that had been closed up for a long time. The first thing he noticed was how dark it was. All the windows were covered, so very little light came in. Marcus used his phone's flashlight to look around. He could see that he was in a large open room with a high ceiling. As his eyes got used to the dim light, Marcus began to see the shape of the space. There were empty metal shelves along the walls. A long wooden counter ran across the back of the room. The floor was made of old wooden planks that creaked when he walked on them. Marcus found a light switch and flipped it. Nothing happened. The electricity had been turned off years ago. He made a mental note to call the power company. Using his phone's flashlight, Marcus explored the main room more carefully. The space was much bigger than his apartment. The ceiling was at least 12 feet high. The walls were made of brick on 3 sides and wood on the back wall. Behind the wooden counter, Marcus found a smaller room that must have been an office. There was an old desk covered with papers and dust. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Calendar on the wall was still turned to March 2022, the month Bill Hoffman had died. Marcus picked up some of the papers on the desk. They were old invoices and receipts from the hardware store. He could see that Bill had sold everything from nails and screws to lawnmowers and paint. The handwriting on the receipts was neat and careful. In one corner of the office, Marcus found a coffee maker with a cup still sitting next to it. The coffee in the cup had long since evaporated, leaving only a dark stain at the bottom. It made Marcus feel sad to think about Bill Hoffman having his morning coffee in this same spot for so many years. Marcus went back into the main room and continued exploring. Near the front of the store, he found an area that must have been for seasonal items. There were still a few Christmas decorations scattered on the shelves from the store's last holiday season. Along one wall, Marcus discovered something interesting. There were marks on the floor where heavy equipment had been moved. Squares and rectangles of clean wood showed where display cases and machines had once stood. He wondered what had happened to all the inventory when Bill died. The back wall of the store was covered with pegboard for hanging tools. Most of the hooks were still there, but they were empty. Marcus ran his hand along the pegboard and noticed that some sections seemed different from others. Some boards looked newer or were painted a slightly different color. As Marcus continued to explore, he began to get a better sense of how the store had been organized. The front area was for small items like screws, bolts, and electrical supplies. The middle section was for larger tools and equipment. The back area seemed to be for storage and special orders. Marcus climbed a narrow staircase to the second floor. Up there, he found 3 empty rooms that must have been used for storage or maybe as an apartment. The rooms had slanted ceilings and small windows. They needed work, but they had potential. From one of the upstairs windows, Marcus could see Main Street below. A few people walked by, but the street was mostly quiet. Across the street was another empty building with a "For Sale" sign. Marcus wondered if he was crazy to invest in a town that seemed to be slowly dying. But as he looked around more, Marcus also saw signs of hope. The bank down the street looked busy. The diner had several cars parked outside. There was a small park with a playground where children were playing. Maybe Millbrook was not completely dead after all. Marcus spent 2 hours exploring every corner of his building. By the time he was done, he was covered in dust and his clothes were dirty, but he was also excited. The building was in better shape than he had expected. Yes, it needed a lot of work. The electricity and plumbing would have to be checked. The walls needed paint. The floors needed to be cleaned and probably refinished. Some of the windows needed to be unboarded and repaired, but the basic structure was solid. The roof did not seem to leak. The brick walls were strong. The wooden floors were original hardwood that would be beautiful once they were cleaned up. As Marcus locked up the building and got ready to drive back to Chicago, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt like he owned something important. This building was his. It was not much, but it was his. Marcus also felt overwhelmed. He had no idea how to restore an old building. He did not know anything about running a business. He had almost no money to make improvements. But for the first time since he lost his job, Marcus had a project. He had something to work toward. As he drove home, he was already making plans. Tomorrow, he would start researching how to bring electricity back to the building. He would figure out what permits he needed. He would learn how to do this. Marcus had bought an old hardware store for $130. Now he had to figure out what to do with it. Marcus returned to Millbrook the following weekend with a truck full of cleaning supplies. He had spent the week researching how to restore old buildings and watching YouTube videos about electrical systems and plumbing. He felt more prepared. This time, his first goal was to get the electricity turned back on. The power company had told him it would cost $200 to reconnect the service. Marcus had to borrow money from his sister to pay for it, but he knew he needed lights to work properly. When the electrician came to turn on the power, Marcus held his breath. Half of the lights in the building worked. The other half would need new bulbs or fixtures, but it was enough to see clearly for the first time. With proper lighting, Marcus could see just how much stuff Bill Hoffman had left behind. The office was packed with papers, tools, and personal items. There were boxes stacked everywhere. It would take weeks to go through everything. Marcus decided to start by cleaning out the office completely. He wanted to understand how Bill had run his business. Maybe there were records that would help him figure out what to do with the building. He started with the desk drawers. They were full of the usual office supplies, pens, paper clips, rubber bands, and old receipts. But Marcus also found more personal items. A photo of Bill standing in front of the store when he was much younger. A letter from a customer thanking him for staying open late to help with an emergency repair. In the bottom drawer, Marcus found something that made him stop and think. It was a small notebook where Bill had written down his thoughts about the business. The entries went back several years. Mrs. Patterson came in today looking for a part for her old washing machine. One entry said, "I do not have it, but I will order it for her. She has been a customer for 20 years. That is what good business means." Another entry read, "Young people do not want to fix things anymore. They just throw them away and buy new ones. But fixing things is important. It saves money and it is better for the world." Marcus found himself reading entry after entry. Bill Hoffman clearly loved his store and cared about his customers. It made Marcus feel sad that such a good business had to close, just because one man died. As Marcus continued cleaning, he worked his way through several filing cabinets. Most of the files contained boring business records, tax returns, supplier invoices, and employee records from when Bill had hired help during busy seasons. But in the back of the last filing cabinet, Marcus found something unusual. It was an old leather folder tied shut with a string. The leather was cracked and faded. When Marcus opened it, he found several documents that looked much older than everything else. The first document was a deed showing that Bill's father, Walter Hoffman, had bought the building in 1952. The second was a business license for Hoffman's General Store from 1953. But the third document made Marcus stop and stare. It was a hand-drawn blueprint of the building. The paper was yellowed with age and the ink was faded, but Marcus could clearly see that it showed the layout of his building. Every room was carefully drawn and labeled. The blueprint showed the main store area, the office, the upstairs rooms, and the basement. But there was something on the drawing that Marcus had not seen in the building. According to the blueprint, there should be another room behind the back wall of the main store. Marcus studied the drawing carefully. The mystery room was marked private storage and appeared to be about 12 feet by 15 feet. It was located directly behind the pegboard wall where the tools used to hang. The blueprint was signed WH 1952 in the bottom corner. Walter Hoffman had drawn this himself when he first bought the building. There were also some handwritten notes in the margins that Marcus could barely read. One note said, "Special inventory, family collections." Another said, "Access from main floor only." A third note was so faded that Marcus could only make out a few words. Safe, important, future generations. Marcus looked at the blueprint again and again. If Walter Hoffman had built a storage room behind the back wall, where was it now? Marcus had explored every inch of the building, or so he thought. He grabbed a tape measure and went back into the main store area. Starting from the front wall, he measured the depth of the building. According to his measurements, the building was 60 feet deep from front to back. Then Marcus measured from the front wall to the back wall inside the store. The interior space was only 45 feet deep. That meant there were 15 feet of space that he could not account for. Marcus looked at the back wall more carefully. It was covered with pegboard painted white. The pegboard looked old, but not as old as the rest of the building. In fact, it looked like it might have been added later, maybe in the 1980s based on the style. He tapped on different sections of the wall. Most of it sounded solid, like there was brick or concrete behind the pegboard. But in one area, about 8 feet from the left corner, the sound was different. It sounded hollow, like there was empty space behind it. Marcus examined that section of pegboard more closely. He noticed that the paint in that area was slightly different from the rest of the wall. It was the same color, but it looked newer, like someone had painted over something. Looking at the floor, Marcus found more clues. The wooden planks ran in straight lines across most of the store, but near the back wall some of the boards had been cut and replaced. The replacement boards were the same type of wood, but they did not match exactly. Marcus was getting excited. It really seemed like there was a hidden room behind the wall. But why would Walter Hoffman seal up a room? And what did he mean by special inventory and family collections? Marcus decided to do more research before he started tearing into walls. That evening, he drove around Millbrook looking for people who might have known the Hoffman family. At the diner, he talked to an elderly waitress named Betty. "Oh yes, I remember Walter Hoffman," Betty said. "He ran the general store before his son Bill took over. Walter was a nice man, but kind of secretive. He collected all sorts of things. Old toys, bottles, signs. People said he had rooms full of collectibles." Betty paused to refill Marcus's coffee cup. When Walter died back in 1987, Bill cleaned out the store to make room for hardware inventory. But people always wondered what happened to Walter's collections. Bill never talked about it. Marcus asked if anyone else in town might remember Walter's collections. Betty suggested he talk to Earl Murphy, who ran the gas station. Earl had been friends with Walter and might know more. The next morning, Marcus visited Earl's gas station. Earl was in his 70s and had lived in Millbrook his whole life. When Marcus mentioned Walter Hoffman's collections, Earl's eyes lit up. Walter was passionate about preserving the history of this town, Earl said. He bought up old items whenever businesses closed down. He said he wanted to save things for future generations. He talked about opening a museum someday. Earl leaned against his truck and continued. Walter was always buying things, old advertising signs, vintage toys, classic tools. He spent a fortune on that stuff. When he died, people expected there would be a big estate sale, but Bill said he could not find most of the collections. This information made Marcus even more curious about the hidden room. It sounded like Walter Hoffman had been a serious collector who cared about preserving history. Maybe he had sealed up his most valuable items to protect them. Marcus went back to the store that afternoon with a new sense of purpose. He studied the blueprint again and examined the back wall inch by inch. He was becoming more and more convinced that Walter's lost collections were hidden somewhere behind that pegboard. But Marcus also felt nervous. If there really was a sealed room full of valuable collectibles, what right did he have to open it? He had bought the building legally, but it felt strange to profit from someone else's life work. Still, Marcus's curiosity was stronger than his doubts. He had to know what was behind that wall. Tomorrow, he would start carefully removing the pegboard to see what secrets Walter Hoffman had hidden away. Marcus woke up early that Monday morning with his heart racing. He had spent the whole weekend thinking about the hidden room. He barely slept Sunday night because his mind kept imagining what might be behind that wall. He had decided to take a week off from job hunting to focus on the building. His unemployment benefits had almost run out anyway, and he was tired of getting rejection letters. Maybe this building would lead to something better. Marcus drove to the hardware store in Douai, the next town over, and bought the tools he would need. A crowbar, a hammer, safety glasses, and work gloves. The store clerk was friendly and asked what project he was working on. "I am renovating an old building," Marcus said. It was not exactly a lie, but it was not the whole truth either. He did not want to explain that he was looking for a secret room. People would think he was crazy. Back at his building, Marcus stood in front of the pegboard wall and took a deep breath. He was about to change everything. Once he started removing the wall, there would be no going back. Marcus started by carefully removing the metal hooks and brackets that held tools. There were hundreds of them, and each one had to be unscrewed individually. It was slow work, but Marcus wanted to be careful. If there was nothing behind the wall, he might want to put everything back the way it was. After 2 hours, Marcus had removed all the hardware from an 8-foot section of pegboard. Now he could see that the pegboard was attached to wooden strips that were nailed to the wall behind them. Marcus used his hammer to carefully pry away the wooden strips. Some of them came off easily, but others were stuck tight with old paint and rust. He had to work slowly to avoid damaging the pegboard too much. As Marcus removed each strip, he could see more of what was behind the pegboard. It was not a solid brick wall like he had expected. Instead, there was a wooden frame covered with drywall. The drywall looked much newer than the rest of the building. This discovery made Marcus more excited. A wooden frame wall was easy to build and easy to remove. It was exactly what someone would use if they wanted to seal off a room temporarily. Marcus found the edge of the drywall and used his crowbar to carefully pry it away from the wooden frame. The drywall came off in large pieces, and behind it, Marcus could see wooden studs spaced 16 inches apart. Between the wooden studs, Marcus could see darkness. His flashlight beam showed empty space beyond the frame. There really was a room back there. Marcus worked faster now, removing more drywall and wooden strips. Soon he had created an opening big enough to stick his head through. He shined his flashlight into the space and tried to see what was inside. The room was definitely there. Marcus could see wooden floorboards and brick walls, but he could not see much else because his flashlight was not very powerful, and the room was completely dark. Marcus needed to make the opening bigger so he could climb through. He used his crowbar to remove more of the wooden frame. The wood was old and dry, so it split and broke easily. After another hour of work, Marcus had created an opening about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Before going into the room, Marcus wanted to be safe. The air inside might be bad after being sealed up for so many years. He used a small fan to blow fresh air into the opening for 30 minutes. Marcus also thought about what he might find inside. If Walter Hoffman had really sealed up valuable collectibles, there might be important items that could be damaged by sudden changes in temperature or humidity. He decided to be very careful about how he entered the room. Finally, Marcus could not wait any longer. He put on his safety glasses and work gloves, grabbed his flashlight, and carefully climbed through the opening. The first thing Marcus noticed was the smell. It was not bad, just old and musty, like opening a trunk that had been stored in an attic for decades. The air was thick and still. The second thing he noticed was the temperature. The room was cooler than the rest of the building. That made sense because it had been sealed off from any heating or air conditioning for over 30 years. Marcus stood up inside the room and shined his flashlight around. What he saw made him gasp out loud. The room was like stepping back in time. Along one wall were glass display cases that looked like they belonged in an old-fashioned store. The cases were dusty but appeared to be in good condition. Along another wall were wooden shelves from floor to ceiling. The shelves were packed with boxes, cans, and objects that Marcus could not identify in the dim light. In the center of the room was a large wooden table covered with a white cloth. On top of the cloth were several items that looked like they had been carefully arranged and then left undisturbed for decades. Marcus moved closer to get a better look. On the table was an old cash register that looked like it was from the 1950s. Next to it was a display of vintage candy bars in their original wrappers. There was also a collection of old toys still in their boxes. Everything in the room was covered, with a fine layer of dust, but nothing appeared to be damaged. It was as if Walter Hoffman had arranged everything perfectly and then sealed the room to preserve it forever. Marcus walked around the room slowly, trying to take in everything he was seeing. The glass display cases contained more toys, some old books, and what looked like baseball cards in protective sleeves. The shelves held boxes labeled with careful handwriting. One box was labeled Coca-Cola Signs 1940-1960. Another said Christmas Ornaments, Victorian Era. A third box was marked Local Business Advertising, Millbrook History. Marcus opened one of the smaller boxes on the shelf. Inside were dozens of old photographs showing the town of Millbrook from many years ago. There were pictures of parades, store openings, and families posed in front of businesses that no longer existed. Another box contained old newspapers from the 1950s and 1960s. The headlines talked about local events, high school sports, and town celebrations. Marcus realized that Walter Hoffman had been collecting the history of his entire community. In one corner of the room, Marcus found something that made him sit down in amazement. It was a leather-bound journal sitting on a small wooden stand. The journal was thick and appeared to be full of handwritten pages. Marcus carefully opened the journal to the first page. In neat handwriting it said, "The Walter Hoffman Collection, Preserving the History of Millbrook and Small-Town America. Started January 1952. The journal contained page after page of detailed notes about every item in the collection. Walter had written down where he got each piece, how much he paid for it, and why he thought it was important to save. One entry read, "Purchased the original sign from Miller's Five and Dime when they closed in 1959. This sign represents the end of an era when small stores knew every customer by name." Another entry said, "Found this Mickey Mantle baseball card in a box of items from the Patterson estate sale. Baseball cards like this remind us of simpler times when children collected them for joy, not money." Marcus realized that Walter Hoffman had not just been collecting valuable items. He had been trying to save the memory of a way of life that was disappearing. Every piece in the room had a story and a reason for being preserved. Marcus spent 2 more hours exploring the room and reading Walter's journal. By the time he climbed back out through the opening, his mind was spinning with questions and possibilities. What was all this stuff worth? Why had Walter sealed it up instead of sharing it with people? How long had he planned to keep it hidden? And most importantly, what should Marcus do with it now? Marcus knew his life had just changed again. Finding this room was like discovering buried treasure, but it was also a huge responsibility. Walter Hoffman had spent decades building this collection. Now Marcus had to decide what to do with it. The next morning, Marcus brought better lighting equipment and his camera to properly explore Walter's hidden room. He had borrowed a powerful LED lantern from his neighbor and bought extension cords so he could run electricity into the secret space. With proper lighting, the room was even more amazing than Marcus had first realized. It was like stepping into a perfectly preserved piece of the 1950s. Everything was arranged with care and attention to detail. The glass display cases that lined the walls were beautiful pieces of furniture themselves. They were made of dark wood, with brass fittings and clear glass that had somehow stayed clean despite decades of being sealed away. Marcus could see that Walter had arranged the items inside with great care. One case contained toys that Marcus recognized from old movies and TV shows. There was a Roy Rogers cap gun set still in its original box, a Howdy Doody puppet that looked like it had never been played with, a set of Lincoln logs with the wooden pieces still perfectly arranged in their container. Another case held what appeared to be a complete collection of vintage lunchboxes, Superman, Hopalong Cassidy, and other characters that were popular before Marcus was born. The metal boxes were bright and colorful, without a single dent or scratch. Marcus moved to the wooden shelves and began examining the labeled boxes more carefully. Walter's handwriting was neat and precise, and each box was dated with the year it was packed. A box marked Penny Candy Collection 1952-1965 contained dozens of candy bars and packages that Marcus had only seen in antique shops. Baby Ruth bars with old-style wrappers, packages of Necco wafers, boxes of Cracker Jacks with prizes still inside. Marcus carefully picked up one of the candy bars. The wrapper was perfect, with bright colors and graphics that looked fresh despite being decades old. He wondered if Walter had bought these items when they were new and then saved them, or if he had found them years later in perfect condition. Another box contained Christmas ornaments that looked like they were from the early 1900s. Glass balls with hand-painted designs, delicate angels with real feathers, tiny houses and churches that sparkled in the LED light. Each ornament was wrapped in tissue paper and stored with incredible care. Marcus found a box labeled Local Advertising Signs and opened it carefully. Inside were metal signs from businesses that had once operated in Millbrook. Murphy's Gulf Station, we never close. Patterson's Department Store, quality since 1923. Miller's Five and Dime, everything you need. Each sign told the story of a business that had been important to the community. Marcus realized that Walter had been saving not just pretty objects, but the actual history of his town. When these businesses closed, their signs would normally have been thrown away. Walter had rescued them. The most impressive display in the room was a recreation of an old general store counter. Walter had built a wooden counter and filled it with items exactly as they would have appeared in a small-town store from the 1950s. Behind the counter were wooden shelves lined with old products. Boxes of soap powder, bottles of medicine, cans of motor oil, and packages of seeds for gardens. Everything still had its original price tag showing costs like 15 cents or 50 cents. In front of the counter was an old brass cash register that actually worked. Marcus pressed a key, and the drawer opened with a loud ding. Inside the drawer were coins from the 1950s and old dollar bills that looked crisp and new. Next to the cash register was a glass jar filled with old-fashioned candy sticks. Another jar held gumballs that had somehow kept their bright colors. There was even an old-style scale for weighing penny candy. Marcus felt like he was visiting a museum, except this museum had been created by one man who wanted to preserve the world he remembered from his youth. Every detail was perfect, from the vintage advertising posters on the walls to the old wooden floors that Walter had somehow installed in this hidden room. As Marcus continued exploring, he found Walter's journal sitting on a wooden desk in one corner. The journal was thick with hundreds of pages of careful handwriting. Marcus sat down and began reading more entries. Today I purchased the last remaining inventory from Patterson's department store, one entry read. Mr. Patterson was sad to close after 40 years, but he said young people prefer to shop in the big cities now. I bought everything I could afford, especially the children's toys and clothes. Someday people will want to remember what small-town shopping was like. Another entry said, found a complete set of 1954 Topps baseball cards at an estate sale. The old man who collected them had died, and his children just wanted to get rid of everything. These cards represent more than baseball. They represent a time when children saved their allowance money to buy something they truly treasured. Marcus realized that Walter had been fighting a one-man battle against time and change. He had watched his small town slowly lose its businesses and character. His response was to save as much as he could, hoping that future generations would appreciate what was being lost. One section of the journal was titled Plans for the Museum. Walter had written detailed plans for turning the room into a public display. He wanted to call it the Millbrook Heritage Museum and charge a small admission fee to help maintain the collection. Children today do not know what life was like before television and shopping malls, Walter had written. This museum will show them how their grandparents lived. It will help them understand that life was simpler but also richer in many ways. Walter had even drawn floor plans showing how visitors would move through the room. He planned to have guided tours and educational programs for school children. He wanted to tell the story of small-town America before it was completely forgotten. But, according to the journal dates, Walter had died in 1987 before he could open his museum. The last entry was dated just 2 weeks before his death. I am not feeling well lately, the final entry read. If something happens to me, I hope someone will continue this work. The people of Millbrook deserve to have their history preserved. These items are not just old things. They are memories made real. Marcus closed the journal and looked around the room again. Walter Hoffman had spent 35 years building this incredible collection. He had invested thousands of dollars and countless hours creating something beautiful and meaningful. But instead of sharing it with the world, Walter had sealed it away. Marcus wondered why. Maybe Walter had gotten sick suddenly and did not have time to finish his plans. Maybe he was worried that people would not appreciate what he had built. Marcus picked up a few items to examine them more closely. A Mickey Mantle baseball card that looked perfect. A vintage Coca-Cola sign with bright colors and no rust. A children's book that appeared to have never been read. Marcus did not know much about collectibles, but even he could tell that some of these items might be worth a lot of money. The baseball card alone might be worth thousands of dollars if it was authentic and in good condition. But Marcus also understood that the real value of Walter's collection was not financial. It was historical and emotional. Walter had created a window into the past that could help people understand and appreciate a different way of life. As Marcus prepared to leave the hidden room that day, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had not just found valuable collectibles. He had found someone else's life work and dreams. Walter Hoffman had trusted that someday, someone would discover his collection and understand what he was trying to do. Now, Marcus had to decide whether he was worthy of that trust. Marcus spent the entire next week photographing every item in Walter's collection. He wanted to document everything before he started researching values. His camera battery died 3 times, and he filled up 2 memory cards with pictures. He took photos of the items from different angles and made sure to capture any writing, signatures, or manufacturer marks. Walter's careful labeling system made the job easier. Each item had a small tag with a number that matched entries in the journal. On Saturday morning, Marcus drove back to Chicago with his laptop and hundreds of photos. He had decided to research the collection from his apartment where he had reliable internet and could work without distractions. Marcus started with the baseball cards because they seemed like they might be the most valuable items. He found several websites that specialized in vintage sports cards and began comparing his photos to the examples they showed. The first card he researched was the 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle card that Walter had mentioned in his journal. Marcus found the exact same card on a collector's website. According to the site, cards in perfect condition could sell for anywhere from $50,000 to several $100,000. Marcus stared at his computer screen. Could that really be right? He looked at his photo of Walter's card again. It appeared to be in excellent condition with sharp corners and bright colors. If the website was accurate, this one card might be worth more than most people's cars. Marcus researched more of the baseball cards. A 1951 Willie Mays rookie card. A 1954 Hank Aaron rookie card. A complete set of 1955 Topps cards in mint condition. According to the websites he found, Walter's baseball card collection alone might be worth over $100,000. Next, Marcus researched the vintage toys. The Roy Rogers cap gun set appeared to be worth several $1,000s if it was complete and in its original box. The Howdy Doody puppet was listed on auction sites with prices ranging from $800 to $3,000. Marcus found that the vintage lunchboxes were also valuable. A 1954 Superman lunchbox in perfect condition had recently sold for $4,000. Walter had at least 20 different lunchboxes, all in excellent shape. The Christmas ornaments were harder to research because there were so many different types and manufacturers. But Marcus found that Victorian-era glass ornaments could be worth hundreds of dollars each, especially if they were rare designs or made by famous companies. Marcus spent hours looking up the advertising signs. Original metal signs from small businesses were popular with collectors. A gas station sign might sell for $500. A department store sign could be worth $1,000 or more. Even the old candy and food packages had value. Collectors paid surprising amounts for vintage packaging, especially if the contents were still sealed inside. A 1950s candy bar, in perfect condition, might sell for $200. By Sunday evening, Marcus had rough estimates for about half of the collection. His calculations showed that Walter's hidden room contained items worth at least $250,000. Some of the rarest pieces might be worth much more than his estimates. Marcus felt dizzy looking at the numbers on his notepad. He had bought a building for $130 and found a treasure worth hundreds of thousands. It seemed too good to be true. But Marcus also felt confused and guilty. This money belonged to Walter Hoffman, not to him. Walter had spent his life savings building this collection. It did not feel right for Marcus to profit from another man's passion. Marcus decided to research the legal situation. He called the lawyer who had handled the sale of the building and explained what he had found. "The contents of the building are included in your purchase," the lawyer told him. "The estate was settled 3 years ago. Everything in that building belongs to you now, including anything you found in hidden rooms." Marcus asked if Walter had any living relatives who might have a claim to the collection. The lawyer checked his files and confirmed that Walter had never married and had no children. His only brother had died years earlier with no children of his own. Bill Hoffman was Walter's only heir, the lawyer explained. When Bill died, he left no will. The state took over his property and sold it to pay his debts. You bought the building legally, and everything in it is yours. Marcus felt relieved that there were no legal problems, but he still struggled with the ethics of the situation. Walter had clearly planned to open a museum. Bill had apparently never known about the hidden room. The collection had been lost and forgotten until Marcus found it by accident. Marcus decided to learn more about Walter's plans before making any decisions about selling the collection. He drove back to Millbrook and spent Tuesday talking to more people who had known Walter. At the town library, Marcus met with Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian. She remembered Walter very well and was excited to hear about the hidden room. Walter used to come in here every week looking for books about local history, she said. He was always asking about old businesses and families. He said he wanted to write a book about Millbrook's golden age. Mrs. Henderson showed Marcus some old photographs that Walter had donated to the library. They showed the town in the 1940s and 1950s when Main Street was busy with shoppers and every storefront was occupied. Walter was heartbroken watching the town change, she continued. When the big stores opened outside of town, the small businesses could not compete. Walter saw his neighbors losing their livelihoods and their way of life. Marcus asked if Walter had ever mentioned his collection or his museum plans to anyone. Mrs. Henderson said that Walter had been secretive about his collecting, but she knew he spent a lot of money buying items from estate sales and closing businesses. People thought Walter was just a pack rat, she said, but I think he was trying to save things that mattered. He understood that once those old businesses were gone, nobody would remember what they meant to the community. Marcus also talked to Earl Murphy again at the gas station. Earl had more memories of Walter's collecting habits. Walter would show up at every estate sale and business closing, Earl said. He always bought the things that other people ignored: old signs, packaging, promotional items. He said he was saving them for posterity. Earl paused to help a customer, then continued. Walter talked about opening some kind of museum or historical display. He said young people needed to understand how things used to be, but he was always worried that people would think he was foolish for spending so much money on old junk. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment trying to decide what to do. He could sell the collection and solve all his financial problems. The money would pay off his student loans, cover his rent for years, and give him time to figure out his career. But selling the collection would mean destroying Walter's dream. Walter had spent 35 years building something meaningful, and his vision for a museum made sense. The town of Millbrook had lost most of its history when the old businesses closed. Walter's collection could help people remember and appreciate what was gone. Marcus also thought about his own situation. He owned a building in a small town where he could afford to live cheaply. Maybe he did not need to move back to the city and compete for jobs he did not really want. Maybe he could build something new in Millbrook. Marcus opened Walter's journal again and read the museum plans. Walter had envisioned guided tours, educational programs, and special events. He wanted to create a place where families could learn about the past together. The more Marcus read, the more excited he became about Walter's vision. A heritage museum could bring visitors to Millbrook and help revitalize the downtown area. Other business owners might be encouraged to invest in their buildings if tourists started coming to town. Marcus realized that Walter's collection was worth more than money. It was worth the chance to honor the past while building a better future. By Wednesday night, Marcus had made his decision. He would not sell Walter's collection. He would try to make Walter's museum dream come true. But first, he needed to figure out how to turn an unemployed graphic designer into a museum director. Marcus could not sleep that Wednesday night. His mind kept spinning with questions about what he should do with Walter's collection. The legal situation was clear. Everything belonged to him. But the ethical situation felt much more complicated. Thursday morning, Marcus called his sister Elena to talk through his dilemma. Elena was a lawyer, and Marcus trusted her judgment about difficult decisions. "So you legally own everything," Elena said after Marcus explained the situation. "But you feel guilty about profiting from someone else's life work. Is that right?" "Exactly," Marcus replied. "Walter spent 35 years building this collection. He had a vision for how it should be used. It feels wrong to just sell it and take the money. Elena asked practical questions about Marcus's financial situation. His unemployment benefits would end soon. He had almost no savings left. The building needed expensive repairs before it could be used for business. You could sell part of the collection to fund the museum idea, Elena suggested. Keep the most historically important pieces and sell some of the more valuable items that are not essential to the story Walter wanted to tell. Marcus had thought about that possibility. Some items in the collection were duplicates or were valuable mainly because of their rarity, rather than their historical significance. Maybe he could sell those items and use the money to restore the building and create the museum. But Marcus worried about making the wrong choices. He was not an expert on collectibles or local history. How could he decide which items Walter would have wanted to keep and which ones he would have been willing to sell? Marcus decided he needed to do more research before making any major decisions. He wanted to understand Walter's intentions better and learn more about the history of Millbrook. That afternoon, Marcus visited the Millbrook Historical Society, which operated out of a small room in the town hall. The society was run by volunteers and had very limited resources, but they had preserved some important documents about the town's past. The volunteer on duty was a retired teacher named Dorothy Walsh. When Marcus explained what he had found, Dorothy was amazed. "We have been trying to preserve Millbrook's history for years," she said. "But we do not have much funding, and many important items have been lost or thrown away. What Walter saved could be incredibly valuable for understanding our community's heritage." Dorothy showed Marcus the Historical Society's collection. They had some old photographs, a few business records, and some documents about important families. But their collection was tiny compared to what Walter had assembled. "Walter never contacted us about his collection," Dorothy said. "If we had known what he was doing, we would have loved to work with him. A proper museum would be wonderful for this town." Marcus asked Dorothy about the practical challenges of opening a museum. She explained that museums needed proper climate control to preserve artifacts. They needed security systems and insurance. They needed trained staff and educational programs. "It is not cheap to run a real museum," Dorothy warned. "You would need steady income to cover operating costs, and you would need to get the proper permits and licenses from the state." Marcus left the Historical Society feeling both excited and overwhelmed. Walter's dream was possible, but it would require a lot of work and money to make it happen properly. That evening, Marcus called the estate lawyer again. He wanted to make absolutely sure that he was not overlooking any legal obligations regarding the collection. Did Walter ever make any statements about wanting his collection to go to a museum or historical society? Marcus asked. The lawyer checked Walter's will and other documents. Walter's will only mentions his personal belongings and business assets. There is no specific mention of a collection or any instructions about preserving historical items. Marcus asked if there was any way that Walter's intentions about the collection could create legal obligations for the current owner. The lawyer explained that without written documentation, Walter's verbal statements or personal plans would not be legally binding. However, the lawyer added, if you decided to honor Walter's apparent intentions, that would be a generous and ethical choice. You are not required to do it, but you would not be breaking any laws by creating a museum. Over the weekend, Marcus researched what was involved in starting a small museum. He found that many successful heritage museums had started as private collections that grew over time. Marcus learned about nonprofit organizations and how they could help with funding and tax benefits. He read about grants that were available for preserving local history. He studied examples of other small-town museums that had revitalized their communities. The more Marcus researched, the more convinced he became that Walter's museum idea could work. But he also realized that he could not do it alone. He would need help from other people in the community. Monday morning, Marcus called Dorothy Walsh at the Historical Society and proposed a partnership. What if Marcus restored his building to house Walter's collection, and the Historical Society helped manage the museum? Dorothy was very interested in the idea. We have the expertise in historical preservation and education, she said. You have the space and the collection. Together, we might be able to create something really special. Marcus suggested that they hold a community meeting to discuss the museum idea. If other people in Millbrook supported the project, it would be much more likely to succeed. Dorothy agreed to help organize the meeting. They decided to hold it the following Saturday at the town library. Dorothy would contact local business, owners, town officials, and anyone else who might be interested in supporting a heritage museum. Marcus spent the week preparing for the meeting. He created a simple presentation showing photos of Walter's collection and explaining his vision for the museum. He researched similar projects in other small towns and gathered information about potential funding sources. Marcus also struggled with doubts about his plan. He had no experience running a business or managing a museum. He was risking his financial future on a project that might fail. Maybe the smart thing to do was just sell the collection and use the money to get his life back on track. But every time Marcus thought about giving up on the museum idea, he remembered Walter's journal entries. Walter had believed that preserving the past was important for the future. He had sacrificed his own comfort to build something meaningful for his community. Marcus realized that this was his chance to do something important with his life. Instead of just working to pay bills and accumulate money, he could help preserve history and strengthen a community. Even if the project failed, at least he would have tried to do something worthwhile. Saturday morning arrived with gray skies and a cold wind. Marcus was nervous as he drove to the library for the community meeting. He had no idea if anyone would show up or if people would support his crazy plan. When Marcus arrived at the library, he was surprised to see 12 people already waiting in the meeting room. Dorothy had invited local business owners, town council, members, and longtime residents who cared about preserving Millbrook's heritage. Marcus took a deep breath and began his presentation. He told the story of buying the building, finding the hidden room, and discovering Walter's collection. He explained Walter's vision for a heritage museum and his own idea for making that vision a reality. The response was better than Marcus had hoped. Several people were excited about the museum idea and offered to help in different ways. The owner of the diner volunteered to provide food for special events. A retired contractor offered to help with building renovations at a discount. But Marcus also heard concerns and questions that he had not considered. How would the museum attract enough visitors to be financially sustainable? What would happen if Marcus changed his mind and decided to sell the collection? How could the community ensure that the museum would continue operating if something happened to Marcus? These were serious questions that Marcus could not answer easily. He realized that good intentions were not enough to make the museum succeed. He would need a solid business plan and legal protections to ensure that Walter's collection would be preserved permanently. Marcus left the meeting with mixed feelings. People supported his goal, but they wanted more details about how it would work. He had 2 weeks to come up with a realistic plan for the museum project. As Marcus drove home that night, he understood that the next 2 weeks would determine the fate of Walter's collection and his own future in Millbrook. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks working harder than he had ever worked in his life. He researched museum operations, wrote business plans, and contacted potential funding sources. He barely slept and lived on coffee and sandwich crackers. The crew. First breakthrough came when Marcus contacted the Ohio Historical Society. They were very interested in Walter's collection and offered to provide guidance about proper preservation techniques and museum standards. Collections like this are rare and valuable, the state historian told Marcus over the phone. Most small-town artifacts get thrown away when businesses close. Walter Hoffman did something important by preserving these items. The state office also told Marcus about grant programs that could help fund museum operations. If Marcus could demonstrate community support and a solid business plan, he might be able to get financial assistance for the project. Marcus's second breakthrough came from an unexpected source. His sister Elena called with an idea that could solve some of his legal and financial concerns. "What if you set up a nonprofit foundation to own and operate the museum?" Elena suggested. "You could donate Walter's collection to the foundation and serve as the director. That way the collection would be permanently protected and you could qualify for grants and tax benefits." Elena offered to help Marcus set up the legal structure for free. She had experience with non-profit organizations and understood how to protect collections from being sold or dispersed. Marcus loved this idea because it solved his biggest ethical concern. By donating the collection to a non-profit foundation, he would ensure that Walter's vision would be honored permanently. Even if something happened to Marcus, the collection would continue to be preserved and displayed. Over the weekend, Marcus created a detailed business plan for the Millbrook Heritage Museum. He researched similar museums and found that they typically needed about $50,000 per year to operate professionally. Marcus calculated that the museum could generate income from admission fees, gift shop sales, and special events. If they could attract 5,000 visitors per year, the museum might be able to cover its basic operating costs. Marcus also identified several items from Walter's collection that could be sold to fund the initial renovations. There were some duplicate items and a few very valuable pieces that were not essential to the historical story Walter wanted to tell. A duplicate Mickey Mantle baseball card could be sold for enough money to renovate the building's electrical and plumbing systems. Some extra advertising signs could fund the climate control system needed to preserve the artifacts properly. Marcus felt good about this approach because he would only sell items that Walter had multiple copies of, or items that did not fit the main theme of small-town life in mid-century America. The second community meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the town hall. This time, 23 people attended, including the mayor and several members of the town council. Marcus presented his detailed business plan and explained how the nonprofit foundation would work. He showed architectural drawings of how the building could be renovated to create proper museum displays while preserving Walter's original vision. The response was overwhelmingly positive. The mayor announced that the town would waive building permit fees for the project. The Chamber of Commerce offered to help promote the museum to tourists visiting the region. Most importantly, 8 people volunteered to serve on the board of directors for the Museum Foundation. This group included Dorothy Walsh from the Historical Society, Earl Murphy from the gas station, and several other longtime residents who cared about preserving Millbrook's history. Within a month, Marcus had established the Walter Hoffman Memorial Foundation as a non-profit organization. Elena helped him file all the necessary paperwork with the state of Ohio. Marcus donated the entire collection to the foundation and was hired as the museum's first director. The foundation's board of directors approved Marcus's plan to sell selected items to fund the renovations. They also applied for several grants from state and national organizations that supported historical preservation. Marcus put his Chicago apartment up for rent and moved to Millbrook permanently. He found a small house to rent just 2 blocks from the museum building. For the first time in years, his living expenses were low enough that he could focus on building something instead of just surviving. The renovation work took 6 months. Marcus learned how to install proper lighting, build display cases, and create climate control systems. Local volunteers helped with painting, cleaning, and organizing the collection. The most exciting part of the project was working with Walter's original plans. Marcus discovered that Walter had designed the hidden room as just the first phase of his museum. Walter's journal contained detailed plans for expanding the display into the main store area. Marcus followed Walter's plans as closely as possible while making necessary updates for safety and accessibility. The result was a museum that looked almost exactly like what Walter had envisioned in the 1980s. The Millbrook Heritage Museum opened on a Saturday in October, exactly 1 year after Marcus had found the hidden room. The opening day celebration attracted over 200 people, including visitors from neighboring towns who had heard about the project. Local newspapers covered the opening, and the story was picked up by regional media outlets. People were fascinated by the tale of the secret room and the unemployed man who had turned his lucky discovery into a community treasure. The museum's first exhibit was called Main Street Memories: Small-Town Life in Mid-Century America. It featured Walter's carefully preserved general store display, along with artifacts and photographs that told the story of how American communities had changed over the decades. Visitors could see what shopping was like before supermarkets and shopping malls. Children could learn about toys and games that their grandparents had played with. Adults could remember or discover the sense of community that had existed in small towns. The museum also featured a special room dedicated to Walter Hoffman himself, Marcus had created a display about Walter's life and his passion for preserving history. Visitors could read excerpts from Walter's journal and understand why he had spent his life collecting these items. Within its first year, the museum attracted over 8,000 visitors. Tour buses began including Millbrook on their routes through rural Ohio. The increased tourism brought new customers to local restaurants and shops. The success of the museum encouraged other property owners to invest in downtown Millbrook. 2. Empty buildings were renovated for new businesses. The town applied for grants to improve streetscapes and promote heritage tourism. Marcus found that running the museum was the most rewarding work he had ever done. He loved talking to visitors about the collection and seeing children discover artifacts that connected them to their family histories. The museum also became a gathering place for the community. Local schools brought classes for educational programs. The Historical Society held meetings in the museum's conference room. Families celebrated special occasions in the museum's event space. 2 years after opening, the museum was featured in a national magazine article about successful small-town revitalization projects. The article brought even more visitors and helped Marcus secure additional grant funding for expansion. Marcus often thought about the chain of events that had brought him to Millbrook. Losing his job had felt like a disaster at the time, but it had led him to find his true calling. Buying a building for almost no money had seemed foolish, but it had changed his life completely. Most importantly, Marcus felt that he had honored Walter Hoffman's vision while creating something meaningful for the future. Walter had believed that preserving the past was important for helping people understand their heritage and build stronger communities. The Walter Hoffman Memorial Foundation continued to grow and expand its mission. They began collecting oral histories from elderly residents and documenting the stories of other small towns in the region. Marcus never regretted his decision to keep Walter's collection instead of selling it for personal profit. The money would have solved his immediate problems, but building the museum had given him something much more valuable: a purpose and a community. On quiet evenings when the museum was closed, Marcus sometimes walked through the displays and thought about Walter Hoffman. He imagined Walter would be proud to see his dream finally realized, and his collection helping people appreciate the past while building a better future. Marcus had started this journey as an unemployed man, with almost no money and no clear direction in life. He had become the director of a successful museum and a respected member of his community. Most importantly, he had found a way to make a positive difference in the world. The hidden room that Walter had sealed away 35 years earlier was now open for everyone to enjoy. The artifacts that might have been lost forever were preserved and celebrated, and the small town of Millbrook had found new life by embracing its heritage and sharing its stories with the world.